Phronesis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you haven't done so, please click subscribe so you automatically, seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? And now, today's show. Today on Phronesis, I have Steve Mortenson. Steve, we are meeting for the first time. For our listeners, Steve has on a Chad Smith, Will Ferrell drum battle t-shirt, so I knew I was going to like him from the very, very beginning. And we talked music for probably the last 5 minutes before we started. Steve is a professor, associate professor of communication at the University of Delaware. You have been exploring dark sides, shadow sides, and I'm so interested in having that conversation, sir. But maybe share a little bit more about you with our listeners, and I'll learn with them.
Okay, sounds great. I fell in love with interpersonal communication and the study of it. I took my first class actually at junior college, and by the end of the class, I said, wow, I not only want to major in this, I want to teach it. You know, it's so much fun, and it's so useful. Like, I think my teacher one time took us out to just the food court, and he's like, look, you can tell what everyone's relationship is by how far they stand apart. And that just like blew my mind. So I've come at it from that. I got my doctorate at Purdue University, and I studied skilled communication, specifically comforting messages. And the sort of the twist that I added to that is I looked at it across cultures. I wanted to see if, for example, my two participant groups were students in China and students in America, and I wanted to see if culture had any influence on what people thought was effective comforting. Like, what do you say when your friend fails a test? Or what do you say when your friend comes and tells you, oh my God, my parents are getting divorced, or my partner's leaving me, or whatever. And I was expecting to find a lot of cultural differences. And my advisor at the time, he had this whole thing laid out about what's a really good supportive message. Like, does it deal with the person's emotions? Does it give them some ego support, tell them they're a good person? And then do you kind of lay in the perspective, right? Because a lot of times we sort of rush in and go, this is what you got to do. And the person's not done emoting. And so this is my advisor, Brant Burleson, he'd laid out this whole thing about what makes a good message. So we tested this across cultures, and we found out, this is the thing that I thought was so interesting. We found that everybody rated the highly sensitive messages as the best. And I was surprised, because I thought Americans are much more, tell me how you feel. Where in China, the cultural rule is, well, don't rock the boat so much. Just, let's just solve the problem. But what was so interesting is that all the Chinese participants and the American participants said, yes, these are the best messages. But would you say those things? That's where they varied. And we found that the American women were much more likely to use those really skillful, sensitive messages than the American men or the Chinese men or women. And so what it really sort of burned in my brain is that we might know what we're supposed to say, but we're probably not going to say it. Like, I might know how to fight fair, but if you're really grinding my gears, I'm not going to do that skillful stuff. And I come from communication science, and I'm a trained social scientist, and I study messages and what are the best ones. But I kept finding that it was our emotional inability to actually use those skilled messages. That was the real problem. And that's where the dark side comes in, the idea of the Jungian shadow, this side of ourselves.
So what would an example be of a statement that maybe one of the female participants would have used in your study at Purdue?
Well, let's say that you had a roommate come in and say, oh my God, my parents just got divorced and I'm devastated. And so the first thing that the real skillful person would do would go right to the person's emotions and validate it. Like, oh my gosh, that must be terrible. You must be so shocked. What a world flipper, and you let that person know it's like, you have a right to feel this way. And you're right. This is really bad. And that might be more than one conversation, given how bad it is. But after you sort of validate where they're at emotionally, you start giving them ego support. You're saying, look, you have lots of friends. There are people to support you. You're a strong person. You can get through this. People love you. There are people behind you, right? And so now you're giving that person ego support on top of validating their emotions. Then after that, you say, maybe this is for the best. Your parents might have been really unhappy and you didn't know, and people do get through this and they come out the other side and they find that they're happier because there's more honesty now going on. So, this has happened. You're going to have to embrace it, but it might be a good thing in the end. But, we rush in with the perspective and we forget all of the emotional part of it. But even before we say anything, we have to get ourselves in the right emotional frame of mind. Because I'm helping somebody confront something right now, so I have to confront it too. But it's so interesting. I was talking to one of my Chinese participants, and they would say, if my friend said that his father had passed away, I would just go sit with him. That's all we would do. And I thought, that sounds very effective too. It's social support. You're being there. So that's the kind of skilled message, that we're looking for, and when I talk to people in different leadership positions, like I've talked to environmental engineers and physicians and educators, and we talk a lot about confrontation. And I talk about supportive confrontation. And with my students, you got to support the person while you critique their behavior. Otherwise, it's difficult for them to hear what you're trying to say. So,
well, it's so interesting how just even the order in which those pieces occur makes a big difference. Because if I come out of the gates with, well, they were miserable anyway, so that's probably for the better.
Right. Or you get the typical guy response, dude, that sucks. Let's go get a beer. And the person's like, what? So yeah, timing is a big part of this. So is sequencing.
Yeah. Okay. So sequencing and timing. Now, when you've worked with physicians, talk a little bit about the sequencing of some of the messages that they have to deliver, because I imagine in that role, and depending on the context in which you were training physicians and working with physicians, but talk a little bit about that space. I find that fascinating.
Well, the people that I've done, I started doing training and consulting at some of the local hospitals here, and it was with pediatricians. And they're kind of like the sweethearts, of the medical profession because they work with kids. But their problem is, how do you get the parents to change things? Like, how do you tell a parent that, look, one of the reasons your child's like on the edge of diabetes is the way that they're being fed and the way that you're cooking. And these physicians would be like, the parents would get mad. They wouldn't take the information. And so it was sort of like, how do we get people who are conflict avoidant to realize that, no, I can actually tell this person something without them getting defensive. And so we talked about ways to do that. But we also talked a lot about just being conflict avoidant in the first place and where that comes from and how that's part of the shadow that we sort of drag with us, from childhood. Like, I avoided conflict to stay safe. I didn't want to get in trouble. Now, the other issue with doctors is, again, confrontation's a fight or flight thing. And so a lot of physicians get angry if someone disagrees with them. It's not that you're saying I'm misinformed. You're saying that I'm wrong, which is, so they equate being misinformed with being ashamed. So they get very They can get very defensive, like if a patient asks too many questions or if they come in with alternate information. So it's interesting to work with them in those sorts of contexts. The environmental engineers, it was a lot about how do you tell people really bad news? Like the law just changed. We got to spend more money. We got to work differently. And you don't really have any power or authority. You're there as more of a consulting role. So it's like, how do you deliver and give advice that people probably really don't want to hear, and make that palpable and effective?
Yeah. Steve, in your work, have you come across people who are just naturally comfortable with difficult conversations, naturally comfortable with that role? I mean, it's really, really interesting because as a leader, the role comes with difficult conversations. It's just baked into the role. And of course, we see in families and we see in any number of other contexts, associations, that there's conflict, places of worship, there's conflict, there's difficult conversations, disagreements. When you come across people who are comfortable in that space, are there any themes you've noticed over the years that kind of emerge for you?
Oh, yeah. I'd say, and again, it all goes back to emotions. It's like, how reactive are you? And some people are incredibly emotionally reactive. In fact, there's a great test out there called the Big Five that you can actually take online. And that's the little variable there. It's like, can you roll with things or do you respond with a fight or flight? And so I think that some people have a little bit more natural equanimity. And then when you sort of put on some strategic stuff on top of that, it really makes them effective. It's like when they realize, like, okay, I'm not going to let this person roll me, but I'm also going to try and calm them down or hold the line, right, in a non-defensive way for them. So yeah, it comes down a lot to emotions and getting in the right emotional frame before you have the confrontation, or as you see it starting to heat up, it's like, okay, I have to take a step back emotionally and try and see a bigger picture here. But that's mostly what I see as a theme, is that they don't get set off. They're able to listen. Generally, they're more comfortable in their own skin. The more confident and comfortable I feel about myself, the more comfortable I'm going to be with you. And likewise, if it's the opposite way. So yeah, those are sort of the themes that I see. And then on top of that, there's this kind of, I want to see things happen a certain way. I'm going to step up. If I'm an emerging leader and I see a bunch of chaos around me, I'm going to step in and fill the void. So there's this impulse that goes along with this non-reactivity to emotions that I see, with people that seem to, especially students, that naturally fall into those roles.
Because I see it happen oftentimes, the avoidance of conflict or the avoidance of the difficult conversation, especially with a peer, especially in courses around leadership where we talk about conflict and we talk about challenges. And okay, so let's jump into the research that you've done on kind of the shadow sides. And I'm interested in this because I want us to get to also a place of a conversation around why this impacts leaders. So let's go there. Let's talk about that research.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about just a brief sketch of what we're talking about when we mean the shadow. And this is originally came from Carl Jung and, the folks that have written based on his scholarship. And it's a child's defense mechanism is what it is. It's something that we do to protect our self-esteem. And we want to do this to fit in with our families and to feel like we're connected to our role models and the people that love us. So, for example, if I'm in a family, this is the common question I ask in classes and with different situations. I'm like, how many people here are helpful people? And a bunch of people raise their hand. I'm like, you like helping? People taught you to help. Your grandparents, or say, look at my grandchild. They're so helpful. You get a lot of good stuff from that. But now, how many of those same people you can't say no when someone asks you for a favor and you don't have time? You don't have the resources. Or even better yet, how many of those helpful people never ask for help? They just sit there and drown, and then their friends are like, you could have asked me 3 months ago and I would have helped you out, right? And the point of that is that when you're in a very altruistic and helpful family, we tend to put our own needs into the shadow. Those might get us in trouble, right? Those might get us criticized. So we're like, well, no, I'm not going to ask for help because I don't want any. Whenever you ask a helpful person, why don't you ask for help? I don't want you to be a burden. It's like, well, I wonder where you heard that from, right? Or the same thing, like you got to help people. You got to help people. And the thing behind the fear behind the helpful person is that I'm not good enough on my own. So I need to do value added with you to help you. And then you'll love me. Then you will like me the way I want you to. So helpful people put socially risky parts of themselves in the shadow to stay safe. Same thing with very polite and kind people. They won't speak their truth. And so this is a child's defense mechanism, but it becomes an obstacle to adulthood. We have to be honest and we have to be polite. We have to take care of ourselves so we can take care of other people. But what I play this game with in the leadership seminars called the yes-no game. And it's where one person says yes, and the other person says no. And then we sort of up the ante to, I have it, I want it. Right. And then they switch places. And then we up the ante to, I don't think that's correct. No, I think I'm right. And what happens is people start getting all these emotions. So sometimes when they say, well, I have it, they'll say, well, I just want to give it to him. Then why? Because it makes me feel guilty. Why? Because that's how I grew up. Right. That's my shadow is holding the line. So we have a shadow around these things that we were afraid of that were socially risky. Our culture has a shadow. Every relationship has a shadow. The marriage has a shadow. There's all the stuff we don't talk about so that we can stay married. Sometimes you'll see brothers and sisters, they'll kind of dish on dad. So they'll triangulate against the parents so they don't have to talk about the things in their relationship. So the point of having a shadow is not to get rid of it, because we actually need the stuff that's in there. It's full of really important things like how to be honest, or like if I grew up in a fighter sort of, like you got to fight for your opinion. You got to, like, I'll always fight for what I want. I'll never know how to back down.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some other themes? I'm really, really interested. What are some other examples of shadows that you often see when working with others? This is really, really cool.
Cool. Absolutely. I'm glad. Well, there's people that are like, this is how I understand it, is that our personality, our strengths and our shadows are two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah,
So if I'm a really organized person and I like getting things done, and my friends are like, we're going to go do Mexican food, and I'm like, good, I'm on board. Then the last minute, they're like, no, we're doing Thai. And I'm like, what do you said you were doing this thing and you messed up my plan. So people that are really organized have flexibility in their shadows. People that are really enthusiastic, sometimes they get very anxious about it. The sort of enthusiastic merrymaker becomes kind of the rush hound, always looking for, like, where's the party? And then they also start to realize, like, I don't really know where I'm going. Like, my life has been a kind of a series of good times, but the purpose part's not there. When we talk about people that really love things, love people, and love, like, they like to restore things. They like great wine. The addict becomes the dark side of that. We get addicted to people. Now we're sort of like encouraged, like binge the show, it's sort of, we're kind of encouraged in our media addiction now. And again, with COVID and everything, it's sort of amplified. Sometimes we look at something really negative, like the outlaw kind of person, the rebel. But sometimes, like, again, as a teacher, at least for me, there's sort of a natural element of subversiveness in it. because you're trying to change and transform people. So you have to sort of show them, you have to sort of break some rules. And I think sometimes the outlaw brings this great sense of freedom to people. I had some students at the end of their senior year, and they came up to me, they're like, "We've never been bad." And I'm like, "I know, you guys just don't break any rules." And like, "Well, we don't want to graduate college without doing something." And my provost already heard about this, so I guess I'm off the hook. But I told him the door of the roof to the building was open. Like, why don't you go on top of the building for 30 seconds, and you guys can just be like outlaws and renegades. They came downstairs and their faces were flushed. They're like, "Oh my God, that was so exciting." I'm like, now you can sneak some candy into the movie theaters and be really bad, So, we need to be able to see that there's another side to our personality, and that the things we're afraid of have a lot of really important potential for us. And that the things that we rely on are also the root of our dysfunctions. So that's kind of where the leadership piece comes in with me. I was really resonated with, I think it's Barbara Kellerman and the crisis of leadership. And she said that the problem with leadership, especially strengths-based leadership, is that it's just too narrow, and that a strength can become toxic, and people don't develop new strengths, and they also don't look at what's impeding them. And so when I look at like my program of supportive confrontation is called Strengths and Shadows. And so it's like, all right, what are you good at, but when does it also undermine you? And there's all sorts. I have a personality test and some different sorts of materials I use. I have some cards that I actually use with people. Like, we have this deck of cards that my wife and we use these with, and you can play different games, because one of the other problems with personality tests is they say, "You're this, you're an extrovert," and the way I like to come at it is like, well, who are you with certain people? Like, my strengths relationally are going to change when I'm with one of my kids versus I'm talking to one of my colleagues. And so I like this more agile approach, and it's much more relational. But that's sort of how the shadow piece comes into it. The other big part of it is that we project our shadows onto people that set us off. Like think of somebody, and we all have these people because we're human, and they're not trying to irritate us, but oh my gosh, they just get under our skin immediately.
I have 5 people in mind.
Yes, right. You're probably sheltering with them, I'm going to guess.
Actually, those people are pretty good.
Those are good. That's good. See, that's my situation too. I've got like my 2 grown sons and me and my wife here, and I'm like, thank God, we're good. No, it's those other people.
We have our moments that aren't good, but holistically, we're very good. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what happens is that when we run into somebody that shows us a piece of our shadow, it sets us off. And we're like, that guy's greedy. I mean, sometimes I can be greedy, but that guy's greedy. I know I'm lazy, but oh my God, look at my neighbor over there in the hammock, and look at his yard. Oh my God, what a slob. Right? And so, because I don't want to see that side of myself. And again, this might also be, this person reminds me of a bully, right? I might be in a conference room with my colleagues, and somebody says something, and it just reminds me of bullying, and suddenly I'm on the schoolyard. I tell my students this, and thankfully it happened a long time ago, but I tell them, generally, if you're in a faculty meeting or a professional meeting and you suddenly find yourself standing and you're leaning on the table and your volume's really up, that's not going to be a good day.
Yeah.
And so it's, how do we not get set off like that? So that the projection part is really the most important piece of the confrontation and the leadership piece for me, because it's knowing that certain people are going to be more of a challenge for me, and having my shadow out in front of me, saying, okay, no, this guy sets me off because of the way he talks, and because he shows me some sides of myself I'm not too happy about either. So I'm going to have my game on with this guy emotionally, behaviorally, and in terms of the messages that I want to use. So another really interesting form of projection is when people get away with stuff that we were afraid to do. Like if you see somebody and you both disapprove and yet envy them, like you would never do that. Be like, hey, God, I can't believe they got away with that. That rat. That's a kind of projection as well. And like I've been doing a lot of this with my students during COVID because things set us off. We read things in the newspaper and we can't believe it. We're living with our parents in a new way. We're living with our siblings. And it's hard. And so a lot of I had a winter session students who were all they're very gung-ho because they're winter session. They're doing extra stuff. And they project a lot of laziness onto their siblings. They're so lazy. They're so lazy. And I'll go, do you have a hard time relaxing? And they're like, yes. It's like, if the more you relax, the less you're gonna, throw shade at them. And then they start to see that. It's like, the more I speak up, the less my over-talkative friend bothers me, So the more I meet that need, like, and some of them are so creative about meeting their needs. And I'll tell them, it's like, I don't know how to meet your needs. You got to do it. It's like, and they figure it out. And they're like, when I learn to relax, I'm not so down on my brother or sister. When I learned that, when I think about how freaked out my parents are right now because of the situation, it doesn't bother me as much when I get right done with my homework and they say, can you do some chores? And so it just helps them. They learn how to do some good self-talk before they go off.
Let's talk a little bit about that. You've said some really, I think, important things, but I would love to sequence some of this because every one of us can learn, develop, and grow. I would love to have a view into the relationship with you and your wife, because that must be fascinating, right? Like your shadow's showing up. Stop it, Steve, Oh,
I know. No, sometimes we'll go projecting. And I'll be like, all right. You're probably right. I'm probably projecting. Go ahead, though. I'm sorry to cut you off.
So my wife's version of that, she's brilliant at this, but sometimes if we walk a couple hours a day. So we're walking a lot and we're with each other a lot. And it's hilarious because if we get into a little snipey type situation, she'll just look at me now like, wizard-like and say, now, how is that statement going to get us where we want to be?
I know.
And I have to sheepishly say it's not,
It's
and then,
not.
or, try and
It
get
felt
myself
good, though.
out. Try and get myself out, right?
I know.
But how do you train people to be, I imagine awareness and metacognition and observing our own processing, our own triggers, our own buttons, and is a piece of this. But it's complex. It's complex. It's a higher level of thinking, I would imagine, Steve.
It is. It's interesting, though, how it can be broken down. And when I have students, especially students, when they write down these different steps that they used to get through a confrontation, it sticks. But these are the basic steps. And you got the first one right off the bat. It's awareness. One of the things we talk about is authentic and inauthentic anger. And authentic anger is, you crossed a line with me. There's a clear transgression. I can tell you what it is, and I can tell you this is why I'm mad, right? But so many other times, like you're saying, we get snipey, and there's no transgression. So sometimes I might get really angry at somebody, and I'm like, okay, I can't figure out what line they actually crossed here. I'm just irritated, And it's like, all right, I'm probably being set off. It's probably setting my shadow off. So, that's one of the first things we look at. It's like, if you're angry, is there a line? The other one is inauthentic guilt. And that's like, and this is one that, as a couple of parents, right? My wife and I talk about a lot. And she'll say, I feel really bad about this. And I'll say, did you make a deal? Did you make an agreement with someone? And she's like, no. And I'm like, you got to make and break an agreement to feel guilt. Otherwise, sympathy makes sense, or I wish I could help this person. But to implicate me because I didn't have the ability or the time to help is bad. It's just wrong. So we'll say, like, is it authentic guilt? Is it inauthentic guilt? Does your fear have an object? Like, what exact, like, is there a big black rabid dog running down the street at you? It's like, now I'm afraid. Or is it more like anxiety, which is just like, I'm uncertain about what's going to happen, right? And so that's part of it. And then the other part is name and claim your shadow. What part of your shadow? Like, I like to be a creative person, right? I like to teach different things and come up with different types of materials. I love all that. But when someone doesn't understand my work, they'll go, well, I don't really get that. I'm just like, well, that's because you're just an idiot, so I will, so there's a victim to the creative personality. And there's also a little piece, I think, of the creative personality that thinks like, there's something that's a little wrong with me. I just don't quite fit with everybody else. So it's very easy for us to feel victimized. So like an example, my wife and my daughter, I'm going to hang out with my wife and have tea. And she said, oh, me and Chloe are going to go watch Gilmore Girls upstairs. And I was like, well, huffy, I got all upset about it. And then I called myself out. I'm like, all right, don't fall into your victim. You're not being abandoned. You're not being persecuted. They're just going to have some girl time. And
you really don't even want to watch Gilmore Girls.
I've seen all of them about 4 times now. I mean, I was the one that made the coffee. I was like Luke with those two. So I've done my time. But yeah, but it's like, so first is awareness, and then is name it and claim it. What part of your shadow is really being activated now? Is it that you have this sort of guilty drudge that feels bad for not doing a favor? Are you the sort of victimized creative person? Does someone just making you angry? Like, the shadow of kind of the hero, the straight talker, is the callous and cruel person. Like I'll ask people that I'll say, do you ever give advice? Like, yeah. I go, do people cry afterwards and get mad at you? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, there's something to that. So you name it and claim it. And then you do some self-talk. You're like, I'm not 10 anymore. I can tell people what I really think, and they're not going to get mad at me. No one's abandoning me. It's just my victim. I think in a nutshell, it's that I want to teach my students and myself as much as possible to have a conscious relationship with my emotions.
Yeah.
I want to be able to.
I love that phrasing. That's
hard. It is. We have a very unconscious relationship. Our fear talks to us and we just listen to it all day long. And we don't answer back, or like sometimes I'll ask my fear, like, what do you want from me? Like, what do you want? And most of the time the fear's like, I just don't want you to be embarrassed. And then I'm like, oh, dude, I'm good friends with embarrassment. We go back a long way. It's going to be fine. Just relax, And so it's talking back to those feelings and naming and claiming that shadow. And then the last thing is, okay, now what do you want to do? Do you need to, and for me, that question is answered by keep your mouth shut. When I'm activated, it's like, just don't do or say anything right now. Cause you're kind of in a fight or flight mode. And what we want to do is to seek assistance instead of flight, or take care of it instead of fight. And if I can't, so it's like, so sometimes it's be quiet. Sometimes it's apologize. Sometimes it's eat some humble pie. Like my colleague who's eating up all the oxygen in the room is a lot like me. So I shouldn't be, because this is when we project on people, we make it harder to see them. Like we sort of look at them through, crap colored glasses. Like we take our own arrogance and stick it to them. And so now they're doubly arrogant. And so now we have all this license to treat them much poorly than we probably should. So we're not going to see them well. So some of the research that I've done is on teamwork and projection. And I found that when people project more on their teammates, when they look at them like they're getting away with something, or they see them as representing something. Like the question is, if my parents saw my project team members, they would not like them. Like they're sort of like the bad kids. And the more that people project on their team members, the more they fight, the more they take over projects, the more they free ride, all of it. Roommates, same thing. We did a roommate study. The more the roommates, and what we found out is most people like their roommates, which was good. But but the ones that projected on their roommates fought more, blamed the roommate more. And we didn't ask them about the roommate. We just asked them, what do you think of people in general? So we had a general measure and then a specific measure, and it was interesting. Now, the latest stuff I've been working on is, can you fix it? So what happens if you take people through an intervention? Does it do something? And one of the things that we found I work with the Blue Hen Leadership Program here at the UD campus a lot, like Tony Middlebrooks, our mutual friend who introduced us. Thank you, Tony. Super shout out to Middlebrooks. Absolutely. We found that if we did take them through an intervention, that they fought less with their teammates. They didn't take over projects as much. They didn't free ride, and they generally had a better view of their teammates. Now, the interesting thing was the general projection between the control and the experimental group didn't change, but the teammate projection changed. So we taught them not to project on specific people, and then that influenced their teamwork dynamics.
So much fun, Steve. So interesting, so fascinating. And I love how you introduce this whole topic that we've been on for about 35 minutes now, of just the fascinating dimension of human communication, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's a fascinating space. It just is. And I imagine in some of when I'm projecting onto someone else, it's also probably much more difficult to see what I own in the dysfunctional system or what I own in the situation, because I'm externalizing it. And it makes it easier for me to have to ignore what I need to work on, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. I don't have to do anything, you do. What's so interesting too is that from a very specific leadership projection or perspective, we also project our potential on people. It's almost like there's two kinds of heroes out there. There's that hero that you see and you're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. I want to do that. How did he do that? I want to do that. So they motivate us, out of a static space to an active space. But then other heroes, we look at them and go, wow, they're so cool. I could never do that. And so we literally project our potential onto them. Jung said that you can show somebody their shadow and they'll kind of deal with it. You show somebody their genius, they'll fight you every step of the way. So it's like we're afraid of that because we know we got to suffer for it. And people might mock us and say, who do you think you are to do that? So when we're leaders and we have people looking up to us, they are projecting their potential onto us. And you know what it feels like to be a role model. It's kind of heavy. You kind of have to live up to it. And we know that if I damage someone's admiration, it's not only if I'm callous to someone who looks up to me, it doesn't only damage my relationship with them, it damages their potential to grow. And we kind of know that. So one of the challenges of being a leader is I have to carry someone's potential for them until they're ready for it. And then I need to give it back and say, now you know how to do all these things. You don't need me. And you can tell when you've done it because the person doesn't quite have that hero worship around you anymore. They're more casual. They're like, oh yeah, that was good. That was great. Thanks for doing that. And you're like, wait, I was a big deal. Like what happened here? Right. But that moment is when you're like, no, I did my job. Now they don't need me. That's, you probably see it, with parenting, I don't, do you have kids? You parent?
We have twin girls that are 10 and then our son is just about to turn 13. So
okay. Yeah,
5th and 7th grade is where we are.
Yeah, you're right in the middle. I got 23, 21, and 20.
Okay.
So now they're very casual. They're like, oh yeah, Dad, you're so smart. We know. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, more wisdom. Thank you. It's like,
Thanks.
okay.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm like, okay, my job's getting closer and closer to being done, with them.
But that means you've...
Yeah, means we did it.
Steve, I first of all, I want to do this again. Second of all, where can we point listeners to explore some of your work? Because I want to take your class. I want to take this class because I want to explore this. Steve, where can people learn more about this topic? What are some resources either that you've written or that others that would help people?
I do have a couple of TED Talks.
Awesome.
So we did these through the University of Delaware, and they were gracious enough to let me do it not once but twice. And so two of the topics we talked about today, the shadow being set off, and then projecting is one called Owning Your Personal Shadow, and the other one about the sort of potential projection, right? The hero part is the hero problem, and those are both TEDx talks that we did at University of Delaware. I'm trying to think. I have most of my stuff is very social science-y right now. I'm kind of in the middle of writing a leadership book. There is one chapter though. It's actually on for women leaders on how to talk about benevolent sexism skillfully in teams. And I'm trying to remember what the book is for that. I'm sure the editors are going to be really pleased. I can't remember that one. I'll get that back to you though.
Great.
I'll send you the link to that.
Great. Well, and as soon as you mention Carl Jung, I think of very thick, dense work. That's at least my impression, right? Mm-hmm. And have you come across a really accessible resource for people to explore some of his work that translates it?
Yeah, I'd say we've had some great luck with American Jungians. And one of my favorite is a writer and analyst called Robert Johnson. And not only does he write really accessible books, they're thin. You can read them in a couple of days. I've given these to undergraduates and they've loved them. A fantastic book about relationships in the shadows called Romancing the Shadow by Connie Zweig and Steve Wolf. Again, really accessible book. James Hollis is another great writer, American Jungian. So is James Hillman, although he's a little bit more on the academic side. But Hollis and Johnson write for your lay people, and they're great writers too. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, and so we've almost been in this for about a year. It's February 11th. I was around March 11th what have you been reading, streaming, listening to? What's caught your eye in recent months? Well,
the things that I'm really interested in right now, it's so funny. I was helping my son with a paper on philosophy, and he was going to look at the Stoics versus Nietzsche. And I said, why don't you look at it in terms of the pandemic? Because we're sort of doing a theater smackdown or a theory smackdown. And the Stoics ended up really, really winning that one. So I'm looking at and talking about leadership during the pandemic. And one of the things that I've asked my students and myself is, what new strengths has the pandemic brought out in you? Like, what are some things? Like, I talk about dark gifts of the pandemic. Like, I've got a lot more patience than I used to because I don't have a choice. I am much more compassionate towards people than I used to be. I used to want to complain and say, poor me. Now it's like, poor me. Yeah, I don't have it that bad. There's other people out there struggling. I appreciate things like my mail carrier and the folks that work like day and night at Amazon and all these people that I don't think I had a whole lot of awareness of before. And now I really realize how valuable they are. When my students do strengths and shadows, one of the questions we've asked now is like, what's the new strength that's been brought out? And some people are like, I'm much more the merrymaker now. I want to make people happy and make jokes. Or like for me, it's like, my sense of responsibility really sort of skyrocketed. It's, when it was time to tell my sons that they weren't going to campus, it's like, no, we're doing this. And I was ahead. My wife and I were way ahead of school, of what we're like, nope, in a month, they're all going to close. So I'm finding that people like Brené Brown, who work with vulnerability and talk so well about it, right now, we have so much polarization in our culture. And one of the things that Brené Brown said that I thought was great was, just because someone's telling you a story that you don't agree with, it's important to realize it means a lot to them. It's so, and I heard when she says things, and part of me is like, wow, that's great. And then part of me is like, oh man, why didn't I think of that? Like, she's always scooping me with her giant, juggernaut of scientists and researchers.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I have a suggestion for you. This is probably the third time I've suggested it on a podcast, so listeners are going to be tired of me saying it. But have you watched In and of Itself on Hulu?
I have.
Give me 2 minutes. Well, I don't want to ruin it for listeners.
Well, no, I can talk about it without giving it away.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were your observations?
My observations were in that show were, at first when it opened, I was just so drawn into all of this discussion about identity. Because again, I think identity is a really important part of what I'm trying to research and get people to become aware of, because I want us to have a fuller understanding of our identities, not just the parts we're comfortable with. So I really loved that. And as the story and the performance sort of opened, I was so caught up in the personal stories of the performer and how raw it was and how candid it was and brave, and how it was so beautifully tied into these other visual things that happened on stage with him. Because, that sort of performance, usually I'd be like, what? Okay, I guess I'll watch that. And this just blew me away. But the end of it, I thought, was fabulous because, again, with this idea of illusion or whatever you want to call it, he was able to conjure these moments of absolute authenticity and emotional reality with people. Like he made them, they felt, what they felt was real. And so I thought it was such a beautiful mix of, again, because art is a good lie. Like I tell my students, it's like, you guys ever seen Saving Private Ryan? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, didn't it feel real? Like, yeah. I'm like, nobody died though, but it conveyed the horror of war. So good art uses lies to tell the truth. And I really think that In and of Itself just like nailed that, with the true stories and yet the things that we weren't quite sure were real, so skillfully woven. So I was glad they put it on television.
Oh, so you saw it actually in the theater?
No,
okay.
I wish.
That would have been very interesting.
I know. I thought it was fabulous. I thought Frank Oz did a great job directing it.
Yeah.
And I think I heard about it watching the Colbert Report. So, or Stephen Colbert. He's like, we produced this thing, and I'm like, huh? And so I'm like, I got to see this, So I'm imagining you really enjoyed it too.
I did. I've watched it a couple times now. It's one of those that I've gone back to, and just to. It's a thinker, that's for sure.
Yeah. What do you think pulls you back into it?
I can't consciously say it right now. It's, he brought my emotional state to a point where it doesn't happen often. And so in some ways, I wasn't even hearing some of the stories, the actual story. I was so drawn into other components that were happening. So, for instance, the reaction of someone reading a letter, I didn't even really remember how he had set any of that up. So part of it was me just trying to go back. Speaking of Will Ferrell, it's like one of those movies. You can watch it 6 or 7 times and hear new jokes, right? But this, it was just a really interesting, and I teared up the second time, even though I knew it was coming, because to your point, you see these just very authentic emotions of all kinds of emotions, right?
Yeah.
They're all kind of right there.
Along with our own sort of like complete bafflement.
Yeah.
As to how this is even happening. Yeah. I think that really gets to it too, is there's this sense that it's getting harder for us to feel things at a peak, I think my son was taking a physical and the doctor goes, well, are you depressed? I mean, like more than most people, like more than regular depressed, it's like when you ask somebody like, how are you? It's like, well, what do you want to hear? My response is I'm making it work. Yeah. That's making it work. But I think that's why that show was so stunning, is that, oh my gosh, it's just so nice to feel something like that again, to feel it strongly again. Well,
him modeling the vulnerability and to perform that 500 and some odd times. That's Steve. We got to do this again, please.
Yeah, definitely. This was fun.
I want to continue this conversation, and I really, really appreciate your time today. Again, we owe a thank you to Tony Middlebrooks. I'm so happy to know you, to have met you, and to hear about your work. Thanks for the work that you do, helping each of us better understand ourselves and be better prepared to serve others and successfully. I mean, that's because leadership is hard work. It's difficult. It's challenging. And I have great respect. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. It was such a joy being on the show, and I was happy to be back again. So absolutely. Awesome. Thank you too.
Okay. Be well.
Be well.
Steve was a really fun conversation, and almost a month later, and listening to it again, really the practical wisdom for me is just that observation that we are each one of us worlds unto ourselves for exploration. It just doesn't end. I wish I could have Steve follow me around and help me understand me a lot of the time. So Steve, thank you for the good work that you do. And we will post those 2 TED Talks that he mentioned in the show notes so you can learn more about his work there. So we have some exciting news. There's a second podcast that's going to be, it's actually already been introduced, and it's called the Captovation Podcast. You can learn more by going to www.captovation.ai, and that's with an O, ovation. And that podcast is really focused on communication and digital presence. So follow us there. If you like these conversations, those conversations will definitely interest you as well. As always, thanks for listening. Take care, be well, and look within. You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.